It's been over 7 years since the first episode of Kill la Kill debuted and introduced us to the world of Honoji Academy. 7 years for people to consume, digest, and reflect on their feelings toward the series. 7 years to have the space to reconsider those feelings and, perhaps, to apply a more critical eye to some of what could be considered the more problematic aspects of the show. So let's look at that one scene. If Only I Had Thorns Like a Thistle performs the function of an introductory episode quite effectively. The order of the world we have been thrust into is established. We are introduced to several key aspects of how this world functions, and most of the central cast of characters make an appearance. Fundamentally, it also introduces one of our primary protagonists, Ryuko Matoi, a teenage girl on an electron quest for revenge against the person who murdered her father. Ryuko engages in several fights, establishing her already formidable fighting capabilities, besting even those students wearing one-star Goku uniforms. Unfortunately, she comes up against an opponent wearing a 2-star Goku uniform, who she is unable to beat, and so is forced to flee back to the burned-out shell of her home in defeat. It is here, in the basement, that she meets one of the other central protagonists of the series, the Kamui Senketsu, and it is this meeting that I want to talk about. The sequence of events is incredibly polarizing, as a review of a number of web essays, blog posts, and even comments in Reddit or on Discords reveal. It is this moment which is cited as the point, typically during a rewatch, where the writer's previous fondness for the series begins to sour and the inherently problematic nature of the series is laid bare. Because Senketsu, having tasted of Ryuko's blood, in his frenzy to consume more, undresses and literally forces himself onto her. So this is broadly interpreted as being a sexual assault, figuratively speaking. And to be honest, if you look at the sequence in isolation, the implication that this is representative of a sexual assault isn't an unreasonable interpretation to arrive at. That's why I think there are so many fans of this series who come to this conclusion. But there's a problem. The scene can't really be interrogated without taking into consideration the context provided by the rest of the series. And when you contextualize the event within a wider narrative scope, a very different interpretation emerges. Considering the thematic aspects of the wider narrative of the series, the nature of clothing as a means of social control, the liminal space between individual and clothing, the arbitrariness of the hierarchical ordering of society, and the patterns of otaku consumption, the significance of the Kamui becomes all the more important. As noted by lecturer-in-law Rosie Taylor Harding, Studio Trigger's anime Kill la Kill depicts a society in which clothing is regulation, where those of higher rank enjoy more rights, better living conditions, and have absolute authority over those beneath them. Senketsu, a name given to the Kamui by Ryuko, means fresh blood. Junketsu, we are told, means purity, and is introduced in a flashback as Satsuki's wedding dress. Ryuko activates Senketsu by accidentally bleeding on it. Satsuki, when she confronts Junketsu, cuts her pinky finger and drips blood onto it. But in the shot immediately following, there is a smear of blood which is positioned directly between her feet. The Kamui are only able to achieve their synchronized forms by the absorption of blood from Ryuko and Satsuki respectively. So, given the nature of the Kamui, both in their dormant and especially synchronized forms, the names they are given and manner in which they accentuate the female body, I think a far stronger metaphor comes through. The Kamui are representative of burgeoning female sexuality, initiated by menstruation. And I'm not the only person to come to this conclusion, as noted by David Boyd. In episode 3, for example, Ryuko and Senketsu battle Satsuki and her Kamui Junketsu. In their battle, we learn the power of the Kamui manifests from the consumption of Ryuko and Satsuki's blood, associating feminine signifiers of virginity and menstruation with the two heroines and their magical power. When the scene is recontextualized with this information in mind, suddenly the coding as sexual assault stops making sense, particularly when the examples of both the figurative and literal sexual assaults which happen later in the series are taken into consideration. When understood as an exploration of teenage sexual awakening, the scene not only stops being problematic, something that wouldn't make sense to begin with, Senketsu is a protagonist, it also fits very snugly into the overarching themes of the show. Ryuko's shock at suddenly having to face the end of childhood and stepping into her identity as a sexual being is met with resistance, but not rejection. After all, she chooses to continue to wear senketsu. And while it is something which comes suddenly, resulting in confusion and fear, through her interactions with senketsu, it is an aspect of her identity that she is forced to confront and, ultimately, accept. Satsuki's experience, on the other hand, is perfectly in keeping with her character. It happens on her own terms, at her discretion, despite the forbearance of both her mother and the protestations of her mother's surrogate. The experience isn't wholly without difficulty, but in customary Kiruin fashion, Satsuki perseveres in spite of it. This theme of awakening to one's sexuality and the self-perception of embarrassment or shame from the perception of others acts as the central conflict of the series' first mini-arc, which starts here and is effectively resolved by the end of episode 3. Finally, it is important to acknowledge that this sexual awakening is facilitated by the characters dressing in seidafuku, as it too has long been symbolic of both youthful Japanese femininity and otaku fetishization. This interrogation of how identity, and especially sexual identity, is inexorably tied to what an individual chooses to wear is important. How this decision both influences and reflects their place within a wider social context, and how it can be a source of both control and subversion, is a line of questioning that forms one of the core thematic threads which runs throughout this series.